I'm here once again with Bonny Specker, epidemiologist from South Dakota State University, who is going to give us an update on what has been happening with COVID-19 in our region, in our state, nationally, and around the world. And also, she's going to give us a mini Epi 101 lesson about something. What do you have for us today, Bonny?
Well, today for the mini lesson, I thought I'd cover some misinformation that's out there and try to explain it a little bit better. The quote that some people may have seen on social media is that you can't blame the coronavirus on deaths among people who get COVID and already had conditions like heart disease or diabetes, since it's really the underlying diseases that cause them to die. This really is not correct. The truth is that people who died from COVID also could have developed other issues or had other problems at the same time. And I would like to talk about that. It originates, this problem, or the source of this misunderstanding is from a table that was put out by the CDC. And the title of that table was Conditions Contributing to Deaths Involving Coronavirus Disease 2019 by age group. And in that table, this is just the left side of the table, there's a whole list of other diseases that are mentioned on the death certificates of people that die from COVID. You can see here there are 174,000 COVID deaths at the time this table was made. But we also had 74,000 of those that mentioned influenza and pneumonia, and 59,600 that mentioned respiratory failure. Well, it's not surprising that many of these people who died from COVID also listed respiratory disease on the death certificate. And a couple weeks ago, we had talked about death certificates and how they're coded. And this kind of ties into that talk that we did. And we had mentioned what a death certificate looks like. This is what normal, every person that dies has one of these filled out on them. And the first thing that is listed is the immediate cause of death. What was the cause of the death right then? And then below those, you start listing the conditions that led to that immediate cause. And you keep doing that until you get to the underlying cause, like what started that whole cascade of events. And that's part one of a death certificate. Part two of it is where you can list other conditions or diseases that may have contributed to the death. And I'd like to just give some examples of those. And probably one of the best is the sinking of the Titanic. Everyone knows about, how many people drowned when the Titanic sank. Well, what was the cause of death, during the sinking of the Titanic? Well, the main cause of death, the immediate cause, was drowning. But it was because of a water transport accident, right? The ship sank, and it was the ship sinking that led to the drowning. If the ship had not sank, it's unlikely you would have had that many drownings. So this, I think, illustrates kind of the thinking behind when you code something like a death certificate. So the people on the Titanic, their immediate cause of death, drowning, was caused by the sinking of the ship. And water transport accident actually is a code for death certificates, and that's what it's called, water transport accident. Well, if we look at things that could be COVID related, we have respiratory failure. Well, respiratory failure, when you just stop breathing, is an immediate cause of death. If you don't breathe, you die. Well, pneumonia can lead to that respiratory failure. And if that were just it, the person had pneumonia and then they died of respiratory failure, pneumonia would be listed as the underlying cause of death. But in this case, COVID caused the pneumonia. It led to the person developing pneumonia that then led to the respiratory failure. So in this case, COVID would be the underlying cause of death, but the immediate cause would be respiratory failure. Now we know that COVID is associated with various types or causes of death, immediate causes, kidney failure, the respiratory failure, cardiac arrhythmias, a variety of things. So in all of those cases, COVID would be listed as the underlying cause of death, even though the immediate cause of death may be something that COVID led to. Now, if you look at that table, the list continues. There's all kinds of things that are listed. And here we have hypertensive disease, arrhythmias, diabetes, obesity. And it's not surprising that people who get COVID have other comorbidities or illnesses that may have contributed to a poor outcome or a death. If you look at just South Dakotans, 28% have hypertension or high blood pressure. 30% of them are obese, and the places I got that information are listed down there at the bottom. Now, if one of these individuals died from COVID, their death certificate may include these comorbidities, since it may have influenced their risk of dying from COVID. Maybe someone who was obese had COVID and obesity. This is true, people with flu or COVID are more likely to develop pneumonia if they're obese. So that obesity contributed to the COVID developing in a pneumonia. Hypertension might be related to whether or not the pneumonia developed into the respiratory failure. It could have contributed to it somehow. Well, those comorbidities would be listed down there in part 2, where you have the significant conditions contributing to the death. It didn't cause the death, but it may have made their prognosis worse if they had COVID. But in this case, COVID is still the underlying cause of death.
It's kind of like a storm of things in a way. It all comes together, and one thing leads to another and leads to another and leads to another.
Exactly.
The individual may pass away. However, if they did not have the COVID, maybe it wouldn't have started that chain of events.
Right. Very unlikely. But if they had, say, a heart attack, that could have been caused, or obesity, hypertension. Those are sort of underlying conditions that set you up for a heart attack. They might not have been the cause of the heart attack, but they're in that part 2 section.